Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Have you ever wondered how a nation so certain of its progress could send 129 men into silence and not hear from them again? In the pages of history we think we know, there are often questions we have never paused to ask. Tonight, we begin with one of them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, tell me your location and local time. It is always quietly remarkable to imagine how many different places and hours gather here together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Long before the ships were locked in ice, long before families in England waited for letters that would never come, the Arctic already held a certain place in the British imagination. It was not simply a region on a map, it was a question, and in the 19th century questions were meant to be answered. Britain in the early Victorian era was a nation of industry and confidence. Railways were stretching across the countryside, factories were reshaping towns. Steam power suggested that distance itself might soon become irrelevant. Newspapers carried stories from India, China, Africa. The Royal Navy, disciplined and vast, protected trade routes that spanned oceans. For many Britons, the world seemed not only wide but manageable. Yet on maps of North America, above the familiar coastline of Canada, there remained a white space. Cartographers shaded it faintly. Lines hinted at coastlines still uncertain. Somewhere within that frozen archipelago lay the Northwest Passage, a sea route that might connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the Arctic. For merchants and politicians, such a passage promised shorter journeys to Asia. For naval officers, it offered distinction. For the public, it stirred imagination. Exploration had long been a part of Britain's story. In earlier centuries, men like James Cook had sailed into distant waters, charting coasts, and returning with knowledge that expanded Europe's understanding of the globe. By the 1800s, exploration was no longer improvised. It was organised, funded, and debated within government offices. The Admiralty, responsible for the Royal Navy, treated Arctic voyages as both scientific missions and national statements. Ordinary life in Britain at the time was less grand. In London's crowded streets, workers rose before dawn to labour in docks and warehouses. In provincial towns, shopkeepers balanced ledgers carefully, aware of fluctuating markets. Coal smoke drifted above rooftops. Churches filled on Sundays. Respectability mattered. Discipline mattered. Faith in improvement, moral and material, was widespread. Religion shaped much of public life. The idea of providence, of a divine order guiding events, was not abstract. It was spoken of openly. Many believed that exploration, like industry, unfolded within a moral framework. If Britain prospered, it was seen by some as confirmation of purpose. This belief did not remove fear, but it softened uncertainty. At the same time, there were tensions beneath the surface. Industrial growth created inequality. Political reform was ongoing, not settled. Debates about labour rights, empire, and governance filled pamphlets and parliamentary speeches. Newspapers reported not only triumphs but scandals. The nation was confident, but it was not without strain. Within this environment, the Arctic seemed both distant and immediate. Reports from earlier expeditions described landscapes of ice and rock, long winters of darkness, and brief summers when the sun barely set. Sailors wrote of frostbite, scurvy, and ships gripped by pack ice. They also described moments of stillness, the quiet creak of hulls against frozen pressure, the pale arc of the northern lights. These voyages were not reckless adventures. They were calculated undertakings, shaped by naval hierarchy and careful provisioning. Ships were reinforced with extra timber and iron. Crews were selected for discipline and skill. Supplies included preserved food, scientific instruments, books, even musical instruments to maintain morale. Exploration was seen as a task for trained officers, not dreamers. The search for the Northwest Passage had already claimed effort and lives. Expeditions led by John Ross, William Parry, and others had mapped portions of the Canadian Arctic archipelago. Each journey returned with charts more detailed than before. Yet the central route remained elusive. Ice shifted unpredictably, channels narrowed, seasons shortened without warning. In drawing rooms and lecture halls, audiences listened to returning officers describe the Arctic. Their accounts blended caution and pride. The public appetite for such stories grew. Engravings of icebound ships appeared in illustrated papers. Children read simplified tales of bravery in schoolbooks. The Arctic became a stage upon which British endurance was displayed. It was within this cultural climate that the Franklin expedition would eventually take shape. But before that final voyage, there was a long history of incremental progress and persistent hope. The idea that nature could be understood, measured, and ultimately navigated was powerful. Steam engines could pull trains through hills. Why should not reinforced ships push through ice? Yet the Arctic did not conform easily to expectation. Unlike tropical seas, it offered no clear horizon of palm-lined shores. Its dangers were not storms alone, but stagnation. Ice could trap a vessel not for hours, but for years. The cold penetrated clothing, wood and bone. Darkness in winter was not symbolic. It was practical and prolonged. For sailors accustomed to routine, the Arctic required adaptation. Daily life aboard ship changed when the sea froze. Men constructed snow walls around vessels for insulation. They organized lectures and theatrical performances to maintain structure. Officers kept detailed logs. Discipline was maintained through familiar naval codes, even when the environment felt unfamiliar. Back in Britain, however, distance softened hardship. Newspapers reported successes more readily than setbacks. The notion of heroic persistence fit comfortably within Victorian ideals. Hardship was acceptable if endured with composure. Failure, on the other hand, was often reframed as noble sacrifice. The economic logic behind the Northwest Passage also mattered. Trade with Asia was expanding. The Opium Wars in China had recently altered commercial relationships. Faster maritime routes promised strategic advantage. Even if the Arctic route proved seasonal, it might still hold value. Admiralty officials weighed these possibilities carefully. Science, too, played a role. Magnetic observations near the pole intrigued scholars. Meteorological data was sparse. Mapping coastlines contributed to geographic knowledge that extended beyond commerce. The Royal Society and other institutions encouraged such inquiry. Exploration was therefore both practical and intellectual. Yet for all this structure, the Arctic remained indifferent. Inuit communities had lived within these regions for generations, adapting to seasonal rhythms, hunting patterns, and ice movement. Their knowledge was practical, local, and often overlooked by European planners who favoured charts and instruments. Cultural distance shaped interpretation. In Britain, few ordinary citizens understood the Arctic in lived terms. They knew it through illustrations and lectures. They imagined white expanses and steadfast ships. They did not feel the slow pressure of ice closing around timber or the weight of months without fresh vegetation. The Royal Navy itself was a world apart. Officers rose through patronage and merit. Discipline was formal. Uniforms signalled rank clearly. Meals aboard ship were regulated. Rum rations were issued with precision. The Navy represented order, even in distant waters. For ambitious officers, Arctic service offered opportunity. A successful voyage could bring recognition, promotion, perhaps knighthood. Failure might be quietly absorbed, provided it did not stem from incompetence. The line between calculated risk and overconfidence was not always clear. By the 1840s, technological optimism had grown. Ships could be fitted with auxiliary steam engines, iron plating reinforced wooden hulls. Canned food, a relatively new innovation, promised preserved nutrition over long durations. These developments fostered confidence that previous limitations might now be overcome. In Parliament and in Admiralty meetings, the unfinished map of the Arctic remained a visible challenge. Each blank space suggested not impossibility, but pending achievement. The belief that perseverance would eventually yield results was strong. And so, when the opportunity arose to mount a final, well-equipped expedition to complete the Northwest Passage, the decision did not seem reckless. It seemed logical. The Arctic had resisted, but it had not defeated British resolve. Each prior voyage had extended knowledge slightly further west or north. The remaining gap appeared narrow on paper. If you had been alive then, reading about reinforced hulls and steam engines, would you have doubted the plan, or would you have trusted in the steady progress of science and discipline? The Franklin expedition did not begin as a tragedy. It began as a continuation. It emerged from a culture that valued endurance, order, and measured ambition. The men who would eventually sail were not reckless wanderers. They were officers and sailors shaped by years of routine, instruction, and service. Before we meet them individually, it is worth understanding that their choices were not made in isolation. They were products of a naval system, of a nation's expectations, of technological faith. The Arctic, for all its silence, had already entered British consciousness as a place to be charted and claimed in knowledge, if not in settlement. Ships were prepared, supplies were ordered, letters of instruction were drafted in careful handwriting, families made practical arrangements. Newspapers hinted at departure. No one imagined silence stretching for years. The era believed in forward motion. It believed that persistence resolved uncertainty. The Arctic seemed a final test of that belief. Britain's confidence in Arctic exploration did not rest on abstract optimism alone. It rested on men who had already spent their lives at sea, men whose habits were shaped by discipline long before they ever saw ice. Among them was John Franklin, a naval officer whose career had followed the steady path expected of an ambitious servant of the Crown. He had not been born into hardship. His family belonged to the modest professional class in Lincolnshire. His father was a tradesman, attentive to reputation and stability. The Franklin household valued order and education. Books were present. Religion was present. Duty was not a concept discussed at length, but it was understood. As a boy, Franklin was not considered especially strong. He was thoughtful, somewhat reserved, and inclined toward persistence rather than brilliance. In a society that valued structure, such traits were not disadvantages. He entered the Royal Navy as a midshipman in his early teens, as many boys of his background did when seeking advancement through service rather than inheritance. Naval life in the late 18th century was rigorous. Midshipmen learned navigation through repetition. They practiced calculating latitude and longitude under supervision. They memorized procedures. They observed hierarchy. The sea did not allow hesitation. Commands were given once. Mistakes could damage ships or cost lives. Daily routine aboard ship was strict. Bells marked time. Watches rotated in predictable cycles. Meals were plain salted meat, hard biscuits, dried peas. Fresh food was rare after departure from port. Clothing was functional, wool and canvas against wind and spray. Personal privacy was minimal. Young officers learned quickly to live within confined space. Franklin served during a period of prolonged naval conflict with France. The Napoleonic Wars defined the early decades of his career. Britain's fleet was both shield and spear for the nation's security. Engagements were decisive and often brutal. Cannon fire splintered hulls. Casualties were accepted as the cost of maintaining maritime dominance. Participation in such conflicts shaped Franklin's understanding of risk. The sea was dangerous, but danger was navigated through training and command structure. He observed senior officers who balanced caution with resolve. Promotion came through a combination of patronage and demonstrated competence. Franklin's advancement was steady, if not spectacular. He developed habits of careful documentation. Logs were kept precisely. Observations were recorded. He earned a reputation for reliability. Those who served with him described him as patient, perhaps sometimes overly cautious, but attentive to responsibility. After the major naval conflicts subsided, Britain entered a period where exploration gained prominence. Ships once devoted to war could now be redirected towards scientific and geographic objectives. Franklin's career shifted accordingly. His early Arctic experiences began in the 1810s and 1820s, long before the final expedition. He participated in overland expeditions into northern Canada, tasked with mapping coastlines previously uncharted by Europeans. These journeys were distinct from naval voyages. They required interaction with indigenous communities, adaptation to extreme climates, and reliance on limited supplies. Life during these overland expeditions was far removed from structured naval decks. Food shortages became acute. Men subsisted on limited rations, sometimes supplemented by hunting when possible. Frostbite was common, equipment deteriorated. Travel over frozen rivers demanded physical endurance rather than navigational precision. Franklin's first major Arctic expedition brought hardship that tested not only his body, but his leadership. Supplies ran dangerously low. Communication with supply ships failed. The group endured severe privation. Some members died from exhaustion and starvation. There were reports of desperate measures taken to survive, though accounts varied in reliability. These experiences left a mark. Franklin gained recognition for endurance under strain, yet critics questioned aspects of his judgment. He was neither a reckless adventurer nor an infallible commander. He learned that Arctic conditions could not be managed solely by naval routine. Local knowledge mattered. Flexibility mattered. Back in Britain, however, the narrative emphasized perseverance. Newspapers highlighted the mapping achievements and the courage displayed. Hardship was acknowledged, but framed within the larger story of progress. Franklin was knighted for his services, a public confirmation that suffering in pursuit of exploration was honourable. During periods ashore, Franklin's life followed the expectations of a Victorian officer. He attended social gatherings. He corresponded with colleagues. Marriage introduced domestic structure. His household valued decorum and hospitality. His wife, Lady Jane Franklin, possessed intellectual curiosity and strong will. She took active interest in geography and imperial affairs, qualities that would later influence public perception of the expedition. Domestic life in Britain contrasted sharply with Arctic austerity. Dinners included roasted meats, vegetables and wine. Conversation addressed politics, trade, and scientific societies. Newspapers circulated daily. The contrast between such settings and frozen coastlines was considerable. Franklin's administrative service also shaped his outlook. He served as Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land, present-day Tasmania. Colonial administration required negotiation between imperial directives and local realities. Settler communities, convict populations, and indigenous inhabitants formed a complex social landscape. Governance was not abstract. It involved daily decisions affecting law and labour. His tenure there was not without controversy. Tensions with local officials and economic difficulties led to criticism. Franklin's leadership style, steady but sometimes inflexible, met resistance in a colonial environment demanding compromise. Eventually, he was recalled. The experience did not diminish his reputation entirely, but it revealed limits. Returning to Britain in the 1840s, Franklin was no longer young. Exploration, however, still attracted him. The Admiralty sought a commander for a renewed attempt to complete the Northwest Passage. Several experienced Arctic officers were considered. Some were younger, perhaps more suited physically to prolonged hardship. Franklin's appointment surprised certain observers. At nearly 60, he was older than many candidates, yet he possessed a distinguished record and public recognition. His name carried weight. The Admiralty valued reliability and honour. Political calculation also played a role. A respected figure could unify support for the venture. The culture of Victorian Britain did not equate age with incapacity, if character remained firm. Franklin's calm demeanour and prior Arctic experience suggested stability. His critics questioned whether adaptability might be compromised by habit. Admiralty officials weighed such concerns quietly. At this stage, Franklin himself faced personal considerations. He had experienced both acclaim and criticism. He understood the Arctic's severity. Yet he also recognized that this expedition might represent a final opportunity for lasting distinction. Within a society that honored exploration, the completion of the Northwest Passage promised enduring legacy. The daily life of naval officers preparing for such voyages involved meticulous planning. Supplies were calculated by weight and caloric value. Canned provisions were contracted in large quantities. Uniforms and cold weather gear were inspected. Instruments for magnetic observation and mapping were assembled. Nothing appeared left to chance. Ordinary sailors enlisted for varied reasons. Some sought steady wages, others were drawn by the promise of adventure. Naval pay was modest but regular. Families at home depended on it. The men who would join Franklin were not driven solely by imperial ambition. They had practical concerns: debts, relatives, future prospects. The broader political climate remained supportive of exploration. Parliament approved funding, newspapers anticipated success. Britain's industrial advancements were cited as evidence that this attempt would differ from earlier ones. Reinforced hulls, steam engines, and improved preservation techniques were viewed as safeguards against past misfortune. Franklin prepared with attention to detail. His habits of record-keeping and routine would guide the voyage. He selected officers he trusted. Among them were Francis Rawdon, Moira Crozier, and James Fitzjames, both experienced and competent. Their personalities differed, but their professional standards aligned with naval expectations. As departure approached, London's docks bustled with routine activity. Cargo moved in crates, sailmakers worked steadily, families visited ships before final embarkation. Farewells were practical rather than theatrical. Letters were written in careful script, folded and sealed. No one involved believed they were stepping beyond reason. They believed they were participating in the measured extension of knowledge. Franklin, shaped by decades of service, embodied that belief. He was not a visionary in the romantic sense. He was a product of his institutions, disciplined, methodical, committed to order. His strengths lay in persistence and moral steadiness. Whether those qualities would suffice against Arctic unpredictability remained unseen. As the ships prepared to leave British waters, Franklin's life stood at a convergence of experience and expectation. He carried with him the lessons of prior hardship, the weight of public confidence, and the quiet ambition of completing a passage that had resisted others. If history often turns on character, it also turns on environment. Franklin's character had been forged in war, administration, and earlier exploration. The environment he was about to enter would test not only his habits but the assumptions of an era. The ships would soon depart, carrying with them not only men and provisions, but the accumulated faith of Victorian Britain in discipline, technology, and perseverance. Franklin's earlier Arctic journeys had not been undertaken with the confidence that surrounded the final expedition. They were exploratory in the strictest sense, uncertain, improvised, and dependent on fragile supply lines. Those experiences shaped not only his reputation, but his understanding of how thin the line could be between planning and peril. In 1819, when he first led an overland expedition to chart the northern coast of North America, Britain's knowledge of that region remained incomplete. The Admiralty's instructions were precise in objective yet broad in method. Travel westward from Hudson Bay, map the coastline, return with information. The terrain itself would dictate the practical details. The party included naval officers, British Marines, voyageurs skilled in canoe travel, and indigenous guides. Unlike naval voyages, this journey moved inland through rivers, forests, and tundra. Canoes replaced decks, portages replaced watch rotations, supplies had to be carried by hand across uneven ground. Daily life during that expedition bore little resemblance to structured shipboard routine. Men woke to frost-covered tents. Breakfasts were modest, often limited to pemmican or thin broth when provisions allowed. Clothing consisted of layered woolen furs, adapted gradually as they learned from local practices. European boots proved insufficient. Moccasins were lighter and more practical on snow. The political climate in Britain encouraged such undertakings. The end of major wars freed naval resources. Scientific societies supported geographic expansion. Yet on the ground, far from Parliament and lecture halls, survival depended on immediate decisions. Franklin encountered logistical challenges early. Communication with supply depots failed. River routes were more difficult than anticipated. Travel slowed. Provisions dwindled. The men's physical condition deteriorated gradually, not through sudden catastrophe, but through cumulative shortage. Hunger altered behavior. Rations were reduced. Hunting parties were dispatched with limited success. Tension grew quietly among members of the group. Leadership required balancing fairness with necessity. Franklin adhered to naval discipline as much as possible, but the Arctic interior did not respect rank. There were moments when reliance on indigenous knowledge became essential. Local guides understood animal migration and seasonal changes. Their practical approach contrasted with European reliance on written instruction. Cultural misunderstandings occurred, yet cooperation was unavoidable. As supplies ran dangerously low, the expedition faced its gravest test. Starvation loomed. Accounts describe men weakened to the point of collapse. One voyager was later accused of murder and cannibalism during this desperate phase, though evidence remained contested. The incident underscored how fragile social order could become under extreme deprivation. Franklin himself endured the same conditions. His body weakened alongside his men. His leadership was steady but strained. He was not immune to fear, yet he maintained outward composure. In Victorian society, composure was a virtue, particularly for officers. When the survivors finally returned after months of hardship, the expedition had achieved partial mapping success, yet the cost was evident. 11 of the original 20 men had died. The public narrative emphasized courage and endurance. The private reality included trauma and doubt. Franklin did not withdraw from Arctic service after this ordeal. Instead, he participated in a second overland expedition beginning in 1825. This time, lessons were applied more carefully. Supply chains were improved. Coordination with indigenous communities was strengthened. The journey proceeded with fewer fatalities and greater success in mapping western sections of the coast. These experiences reinforced two contrasting impressions. On one hand, they demonstrated that Arctic exploration required flexibility and collaboration. On the other, they reinforced the belief that persistence, when paired with improved planning, could overcome obstacles. Back in Britain, the public saw Franklin as a figure of endurance. Engravings depicted rugged landscapes and steadfast officers. Lectures delivered upon his return attracted attentive audiences. Arctic exploration was becoming part of national identity. Daily life in Britain during the 1820s and 1830s continued to transform. Industrial towns expanded. Steamships began to supplement sail in commercial trade. Canned food technology improved, promising longer storage without spoilage. These developments influenced thinking about future Arctic voyages. Franklin's appointment as Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land in 1837 marked a shift from exploration to administration. Colonial governance presented different challenges. Convict labour formed the backbone of local economy. Settler communities demanded infrastructure and stability. Indigenous populations faced displacement and marginalisation. Franklin's approach to governance was methodical. He sought to apply structured principles to complex social conditions. Yet colonial society did not always respond predictably. Economic downturns created unrest. Disputes with subordinates emerged. Critics described him as honourable but lacking political agility. The recall from his colonial post in 1843 left him without active command. He returned to England to a society that still respected his Arctic achievements, but regarded his administrative tenure as mixed. For a naval officer accustomed to purpose, inactivity could feel unsettling. It was during this period that renewed interest in completing the Northwest Passage gained momentum. Earlier expeditions by others had filled gaps along the Canadian Arctic coastline. Only a central portion remained uncharted. Admiralty officials believed that with reinforced ships and steam assistance, a final push might succeed. Franklin's previous Arctic hardships did not disqualify him. Instead, they reinforced his suitability in the eyes of supporters. He had survived extreme conditions. He had demonstrated endurance. Critics questioned whether age and prior strain might limit him. Admiralty deliberations weighed such concerns quietly. The cultural environment of Britain in the mid-1840s favoured resolution. The empire expanded overseas. Scientific exhibitions displayed industrial progress. Newspapers reported global developments daily. Confidence in systematic improvement was strong. Within naval circles, Arctic service retained prestige. Officers such as Crozier and Fitzjames had already gained polar experience. They understood ice navigation, wintering procedures, and the management of crews in confined conditions. The planned expedition would combine experience with new technology. Franklin's own habits reflected preparation. He reviewed charts. He studied reports from earlier voyages. He considered provisioning carefully. He understood that morale during prolonged ice entrapment would require structure. Books, games, and organized routines were included among supplies. The broader public saw the forthcoming expedition as culmination rather than experiment. The Arctic had been approached from east and west. The remaining channel seemed navigable on paper. Maps suggested continuity. Few fully grasped how variable sea ice patterns could disrupt theoretical routes. Daily life for the men selected for the voyage followed established naval patterns. Recruitment favoured experienced seamen. Officers were chosen for competence and familiarity with Arctic service. Families received assurances of adequate provisioning. Pay structures were confirmed. Franklin's earlier experiences had taught him caution. Yet they also taught him that public perception favoured bold completion. He was aware that this voyage would likely define his legacy. In a society attentive to honour, legacy mattered. As preparations advanced, optimism did not appear reckless. Ships would carry heating systems to improve winter comfort. Iron plating reinforced bows against ice pressure. Steam engines could assist manoeuvring in narrow channels. Provisions were packed in unprecedented quantities. Franklin's internal life during this period remains partly inferred. Letters suggest calm determination. He did not express visible doubt in official correspondence. Victorian norms discouraged overt acknowledgement of uncertainty in public documents. Resolve was expected. The environment he was about to enter remained unchanged by technological progress. Ice would still form unpredictably. Temperatures would still plunge far below freezing. Isolation would still sever communication. Yet belief in preparation was strong. If earlier expeditions had revealed Arctic hardship, they had also revealed human adaptability. That lesson lingered. Franklin's prior trials seemed proof that endurance could carry men through difficulty. The stage was set for departure. The past had shaped expectations. The future remained unwritten. By the mid-1840s, Britain stood at a particular moment in its history, confident, organised, and increasingly certain that disciplined effort could solve even the most stubborn geographic problems. The unfinished Northwest Passage was no longer a speculative dream. It was seen as the final segment in a map that was almost complete. Industrial progress shaped this confidence. Steam engines powered factories and railways across England. Iron bridges spanned rivers that had once limited transport. Telegraph experiments hinted that communication itself might soon move faster than ships. These innovations fostered a broader assumption that obstacles were temporary and that methodical engineering would overcome them. The Admiralty shared this outlook. Earlier Arctic voyages had been constrained by sail alone. Now, auxiliary steam engines could provide propulsion when winds failed. Reinforced hulls strengthened with iron plating promised resistance against crushing ice. Heating systems were installed to improve winter living conditions. Each modification suggested improvement over past attempts. Public exhibitions displayed industrial achievements to enthusiastic crowds. Scientific societies gathered regularly to discuss magnetic observations, meteorology, and cartography. Exploration was no longer solely a naval pursuit. It intersected with intellectual life. Completing the Northwest Passage would not only serve commerce but also confirm Britain's standing as leader in science and navigation. In Parliament, Arctic exploration did not provoke serious opposition. Funding was approved without dramatic debate. The cost, while significant, was small compared to military expenditures. Newspapers framed the upcoming voyage as a logical continuation of prior efforts rather than a gamble. At the same time, everyday life in Britain remained grounded in routine. In London, clerks recorded transactions by lamplight. Dock workers unloaded cargo from ships arriving from India and the Caribbean. Families read serialized novels in evening papers. Religious services continued weekly, reinforcing moral expectations of duty and perseverance. Social hierarchy remained visible. Aristocratic patrons attended lectures alongside middle-class professionals. Naval officers occupied respected positions within this structure. Uniforms symbolized not only authority but trust. The Royal Navy embodied national discipline, and its officers were expected to reflect composure. Within this climate, completing the Northwest Passage became both practical, objective, and symbolic achievement. It represented mastery over environment, proof that British organisation could extend even into the Arctic archipelago. Technological optimism, however, carried assumptions. Canned food, for instance, had advanced significantly since Franklin's earlier expeditions. Contractors supplied thousands of tins containing preserved meat and vegetables. The sealing process was believed reliable. Few questioned whether long-term storage under extreme conditions might introduce unforeseen risks. Steam engines installed on the ships were adapted from railway locomotives. They were not designed for continuous Arctic operation, but intended to assist when navigating ice channels. Coal supplies were limited by storage capacity. Even so, the presence of steam reinforced the sense that the expedition differed fundamentally from those that had preceded it. Victorian society valued improvement through incremental refinement. Each new attempt at the passage had extended mapped coastline. The remaining gap seemed manageable. Admiralty charts displayed routes charted by Parry and others, leaving only a narrow corridor unexplored. Yet the Arctic environment did not conform to neat representation. Sea ice shifted according to wind and current patterns not yet fully understood. Channels that appeared open in summer could close abruptly. Winter darkness lasted months, bringing temperatures capable of freezing mercury. Inuit communities navigated these realities through generational knowledge. Their survival strategies emphasized seasonal migration, flexible shelter, and careful hunting patterns. European planners acknowledged their presence, but did not always integrate their methods into expedition planning. Confidence in naval self-sufficiency remained strong. Within the Admiralty, selection of officers reflected both merit and reputation. Crozier, experienced in polar navigation, was appointed captain of HMS Terror. Fitzjames, energetic and socially adept, commanded HMS Erebus in practice, though Franklin held overall authority. Their combined experience balanced Franklin's seniority. Daily preparations occupied months. Dockyards echoed with hammering as final reinforcements were secured. Carpenters inspected beams. Engineers tested steam components. Provisions were loaded systematically, recorded in manifests with precision. Families visited before departure. Wives and mothers brought small personal items, books, letters, perhaps tokens of remembrance. Such gestures were practical rather than theatrical. Naval families were accustomed to absence. Voyages could last years. Newspapers reported on the ships with restrained enthusiasm. Illustrations depicted sturdy vessels against stylized ice. The public understood risk, but believed it mitigated by preparation. Editorials expressed confidence in Franklin's leadership. Franklin himself maintained a composed demeanor. He attended briefings, reviewed charts, and corresponded with officials. There was no outward display of doubt. Victorian leadership ideals favored steady expression rather than dramatic declaration. Religious observance formed part of naval routine. Chaplains were not included on every expedition, but officers ensured Sunday services when possible. Faith provided structure and comfort. Many sailors interpreted survival and hardship through religious framework, seeing providence in both success and adversity. Economic motivations remained present but secondary in public discussion. Trade with Asia through established southern routes was already profitable. The Northwest Passage promised strategic advantage more than immediate commercial necessity. Prestige and knowledge were equally valued. At home, the idea of exploration intersected with education. School books included simplified accounts of Arctic voyages. Children learned names of explorers as part of geography lessons. The Arctic was distant but familiar through narrative. Yet beneath optimism lay practical awareness. Admiralty instructions emphasized caution. If ice blocked progress, wintering in place was expected. Supplies were calculated for multiple years. The possibility of delay was anticipated, though prolonged silence was not. The Victorian era prized self-control. Emotional restraint was considered strength. This cultural value influenced how risk was perceived. A well-prepared expedition led by experienced officers seemed not daring but measured. As departure approached in 1845, final inspections were conducted. The ships were provisioned for 3 years. Heating systems were tested. Libraries of books were stored to occupy winter evenings. Even a small organ was included for recreation. The broader society saw the voyage as culmination. If earlier attempts had been preliminary, this one was definitive. The Admiralty believed that with sufficient persistence, the remaining passage would yield. If one stood on the docks at that moment, watching the reinforced hulls resting in calm water, it would have been difficult to foresee years of silence. Everything appeared orderly. Lists were checked. Officers in uniform moved with purpose. The Arctic itself remained unchanged, distant and indifferent. But in Britain, confidence in discipline and technology had reached a level where hesitation seemed unnecessary. The decision to appoint John Franklin to lead the expedition in 1845 did not arise from impulse. It followed discussion within Admiralty offices where experience, reputation, and political considerations were weighed together. Several names were proposed. Some officers possessed recent Arctic familiarity, others were younger and physically resilient. Yet Franklin's selection reflected more than calculation of stamina. He carried recognition. He had endured hardship. He was known to Parliament and to the public. In an era attentive to honour and visibility, these qualities mattered. The Admiralty sought not only competence but confidence. Confidence among officers, among sailors, and among the wider society observing from a distance. Franklin's age, nearly 60, was noted, but not treated as disqualifying. Victorian attitudes toward age emphasized steadiness rather than decline, provided health remained adequate. Franklin had maintained composure through prior expeditions and administrative service. He projected reliability. Within Admiralty correspondence, practical matters dominated. The commander would be responsible for charting unexplored coastline, conducting magnetic observations, and preserving discipline during potential winter confinement. He would also serve as representative of British authority in remote territory. Crozier, appointed captain of Terror, had significant polar experience and was respected for technical skill. Fitzjames, who would command Erebus operationally, brought energy and social ease that complemented Franklin's measured style. The combination was viewed as balanced rather than competitive. Behind these decisions lay subtle social forces. The Royal Navy functioned through hierarchy and patronage. Recommendations carried weight. Franklin's established relationships within naval circles supported his candidacy. His knighthood symbolized public trust. Lady Jane Franklin also influenced perception. Intelligent and articulate, she maintained active interest in geographic exploration. Her social presence reinforced her husband's standing. Victorian society valued strong domestic partnerships, and her advocacy contributed to Franklin's public image as devoted and purposeful. As official appointment became certain, planning intensified. Provisions were not simply loaded, they were calculated for extended duration. The Admiralty intended the ships to be self-sufficient for at least 3 years. This assumption reflected lessons from earlier expeditions where resupply proved unreliable. Canned goods comprised a significant portion of supplies. Thousands of tins were ordered, containing preserved meats and vegetables. The contractor responsible worked under time constraints. Inspection procedures existed, though standards for long-term Arctic storage were still developing. The ships themselves, Erebus and Terror, were not newly constructed. They had served in earlier polar voyages and had proven durable. For this expedition, they were refitted extensively. Iron plating reinforced bows. Internal heating systems using steam pipes aimed to moderate winter cold. These features fostered belief in improved survivability. Daily life for officers during preparation was administrative and structured. Meetings with Admiralty officials addressed objectives and contingency plans. Charts were reviewed carefully. Scientific instruments were tested. Written instructions outlined routes and expectations, but allowed for discretion in decision-making. Sailors enlisted for the voyage with varied motivations. Some were seasoned seamen accustomed to long absence. Others were drawn by additional pay incentives offered for Arctic service. For many, naval employment provided stability in a society where industrial labour could be uncertain. In dockside taverns, conversation likely included speculation about ice conditions and rumours from previous expeditions. Yet such discussions did not challenge the overall sense of order. The Royal Navy's reputation provided reassurance. Religious observance accompanied preparation. Services were held before departure, invoking protection and safe return. In Victorian Britain, faith intertwined with duty. Exploration was not viewed as defiance of nature, but as engagement with it under divine providence. Political oversight remained present but restrained. Parliament expected progress reports when possible. However, given the remoteness of the Arctic, communication delays were accepted. Silence for several seasons would not initially provoke alarm. Franklin's internal state at this stage can be inferred through letters and accounts. He expressed confidence without overt boastfulness. He was aware that this expedition would likely define his legacy, yet he approached the task as continuation of service rather than personal quest. The social climate of Britain reinforced the idea that disciplined effort justified risk. Industrial workers accepted long hours for economic advancement. Soldiers served abroad in colonial campaigns. Arctic exploration fit within this broader framework of national endeavour. Families prepared for absence in practical ways. Financial arrangements were confirmed. Wills were updated as precaution, a customary step before long voyages. Farewells were composed rather than dramatic. Naval households were accustomed to parting. Public interest manifested through newspaper coverage and engravings of the ships. Artists depicted sturdy vessels against stylized ice fields. These images shaped popular imagination, presenting exploration as structured and purposeful. Within Admiralty instructions, caution remained explicit. Franklin was advised to avoid unnecessary risk and to return if conditions proved impassable. The mission was ambitious but not intended as reckless. The economic landscape of Britain continued to expand. Factories produced textiles at unprecedented scale. Steamships connected major ports. The Empire's reach extended across continents. Against this backdrop, completing the Northwest Passage appeared consistent with national trajectory. Franklin assembled his officers for final briefings. Hierarchy was clear. Responsibilities were assigned. Expectations were communicated without flourish. Naval culture emphasized clarity over emotion. As departure neared in May 1845, the ships lay ready at Greenhithe on the Thames. Crews finalized stowage. Coal supplies were secured. Scientific instruments were stored carefully to avoid damage. Visitors came aboard before final sailing. Admiralty officials inspected accommodations. Families toured cabins arranged for prolonged habitation. Heating pipes ran discreetly along bulkheads. Shelves of books suggested intention to maintain intellectual engagement during winter confinement. The ship's complements totaled 129 officers and men. Each carried personal belongings limited by space constraints. Uniforms, wool garments, and cold weather gear were distributed systematically. Franklin stood at the intersection of expectation and uncertainty. He embodied Victorian virtues, steadiness, endurance, and disciplined optimism. The Admiralty entrusted him with resources unmatched in previous Arctic efforts. If one considered the cumulative preparation, the reinforced hulls, steam engines, preserved provisions, experienced officers, the plan appeared measured. The Arctic remained formidable, yet Britain believed it had narrowed the margin between hazard and control. The ships would soon leave British waters, passing from structured docks into open sea. Their course would carry them northward through known routes toward uncharted channels. When HMS Erebus and HMS Terror lay anchored in the Thames estuary in the spring of 1845, they did not appear experimental. They looked deliberate. Their hulls were dark, solid, reinforced in ways invisible to casual observers but reassuring to those who understood shipbuilding. These vessels had once bombarded coastal fortifications in earlier wars. Now they had been reshaped for cold seas. The refitting had been extensive. Iron plates strengthened the bows to resist pack ice. Internal beams were thickened. The ship's rudders and propellers could be lifted into protective housings when ice threatened to crush them. Auxiliary steam engines, salvaged from railway locomotives, were installed to assist manoeuvring in narrow channels where wind alone might fail. Coal storage was calculated carefully. The engines were not intended for constant propulsion but for strategic use. Admiralty planners assumed that careful rationing would allow months of supplemental power. The presence of steam symbolized progress. It suggested that wind and current would not dictate every movement. Heating systems were another innovation. Steam pipes ran below decks to moderate interior temperatures during winter. Earlier Arctic expeditions had relied on stoves and insulation. Now warmth could be distributed more evenly. This detail, practical and unremarkable on paper, reinforced the belief that hardship would be manageable. Provisions filled nearly every available space. Salted beef and pork remained staples, packed in barrels. Hardtack biscuits were stacked in crates. Dried peas, flour, tea and sugar were loaded in measured quantities. The most modern addition was the large supply of canned food, tinned meat and vegetables sealed in metal containers. The preservation method had gained popularity in naval circles, promising durability over long voyages. Water storage was organized in casks, though snow and ice could supplement supply when melted. Lime juice was included to prevent scurvy, reflecting lessons from earlier naval experience. Medical stores were comprehensive for the time: laudanum for pain, bandages, surgical instruments, and limited antiseptics. Scientific instruments were handled with equal care. Chronometers for navigation, sextants for celestial observation, barometers, and magnetic measuring devices were secured in padded cases. The expedition's purpose extended beyond mere transit. It would collect data on magnetism and geography, contributing to scientific understanding. Cabins were arranged with order. Officers' quarters contained desks and shelves. Personal libraries were modest but deliberate. Books on navigation, natural philosophy, and literature were selected to occupy winter months. An organ and other musical instruments were brought aboard to sustain morale. The crews were chosen with attention to experience. Many had served on prior Arctic voyages. Others were seasoned seamen accustomed to long deployments. The total complement numbered 129 officers, petty officers, and sailors. Each had defined duties: navigation, engineering, carpentry, medical care, cooking, and general maintenance. Daily life aboard before departure reflected naval discipline. Bells marked watches, inspections ensured equipment readiness. Uniforms were worn with formality while in port. Conversations among sailors ranged from speculation about ice conditions to ordinary concerns about family and wages. Families visited during final days at anchor. Wives and children boarded briefly, observing cramped cabins and narrow passageways that would define their loved one's world for years. These visits were composed. Naval culture discouraged overt display of anxiety. Absence was a familiar reality. Lady Jane Franklin's presence during preparations attracted attention. She visited the ships, conversed with officers, and expressed measured confidence. Her interest in exploration was well known. She supported the expedition publicly and privately, reinforcing her husband's resolve. The political climate at departure remained calm. There were no major domestic crises demanding immediate attention. Newspapers covered the expedition as part of a broader narrative of imperial progress. Readers in London and provincial towns alike followed updates with quiet interest. On 19 May 1845, the ships departed from Greenhithe. They moved down the Thames, past familiar shorelines, toward open sea. Observers gathered along the banks. Flags were raised. There was no dramatic farewell speech recorded, only orderly movement. As they reached the channel and headed north, routine settled quickly. Watches rotated predictably. Meals were served at set hours. Officers reviewed charts and planned routes. The first leg of the journey followed established paths toward Greenland, where final supplies would be obtained. The Arctic environment remained distant at this stage. Summer seas were navigable. The ships sailed without immediate obstacle. Morale was steady. Letters were written during stops and sent home before the last reliable postal connection. At Greenland's Disco Bay, additional oxen were slaughtered for fresh meat. Final letters were dispatched. Whaling ships encountered the expedition in late July, reporting that Franklin's vessels were in good condition and spirits appeared high. This would become the last confirmed European sighting. Daily life aboard during this period reflected normal naval order. Decks were scrubbed regularly. Equipment was inspected. Officers maintained journals. Sailors engaged in maintenance tasks between watches. Even as the ships moved farther north, routine persisted. The cultural values carried aboard were those of Victorian Britain: discipline, hierarchy, faith in preparation. Sunday services were conducted when possible. Hymns were sung. Scripture was read. For many, these practices provided structure and reassurance. As the ships entered Baffin Bay and approached Lancaster Sound, the landscape changed gradually. Icebergs drifted in slow procession. The air grew colder. Sunlight lingered longer in the sky as summer progressed toward Arctic brightness. Franklin's leadership style aboard remained steady. He did not govern through visible intensity but through quiet expectation of compliance. Crozier oversaw navigation with technical competence. Fitzjames maintained correspondence and morale, balancing formal authority with approachability. The crews adapted clothing accordingly. Heavy wool layers replaced lighter garments. Fur-lined caps were issued. Gloves were worn even during deck work. Carpenters inspected hull integrity as ice floes brushed against reinforced bows. At this stage, the expedition's progress appeared promising. Channels were open. Steam engines were tested briefly to ensure functionality. Coal consumption was monitored carefully. The social dynamics aboard were predictable. Officers dined separately from enlisted men. Rank determined sleeping quarters and rations. Yet shared environment fostered interdependence. Survival in Arctic conditions would require cooperation across hierarchy. As August approached, pack ice began to thicken. The ships advanced cautiously. Navigation required vigilance. Ice could shift rapidly under wind influence. The reinforced bows performed as designed, parting thinner floes. No immediate alarm arose. Wintering in the Arctic was anticipated if necessary. Provisions were calculated for such possibility. The ships were prepared to anchor securely in ice. The last known letters sent from Greenland expressed optimism. Franklin wrote of favourable conditions and strong crew morale. Nothing in those words suggested impending silence. If one considers this stage alone, the expedition resembled previous Arctic voyages, structured, prepared, measured. The men aboard believed they were participants in a calculated endeavour, supported by the most advanced resources available to them. They sailed onward into channels increasingly choked with ice, confident that reinforcement and steam assistance would permit progress where earlier ships had been turned back. By late summer of 1845, Erebus and Terror had moved steadily westward through Lancaster Sound, entering the maze of channels that formed the Canadian Arctic archipelago. At first, conditions seemed favourable. The season was still open. Ice drifted but did not yet form an impenetrable barrier. Officers noted progress in their logs with cautious approval. The ships followed routes previously charted in part by Parry and others. Land masses appeared intermittently through mist low, barren islands edged with gravel beaches and rising ridges. Vegetation was sparse, limited to moss and hardy shrubs clinging to thin soil. There were no forests, no visible settlements, only the austere landscape of Arctic coastline. Daily life aboard began to shift as navigation grew more deliberate. Ice required constant observation. Lookouts scanned for pressure ridges, and leads narrow openings of water between flows. The steam engines were employed selectively, assisting movement when wind proved insufficient. Coal use was monitored carefully. The engine's presence provided reassurance but not limitless mobility. Temperatures dropped gradually as summer waned. Frost formed overnight on rigging. Sailors wore layered clothing during deck watches. Breath condensed in the air. Yet morale remained stable. Wintering in the Arctic was part of the plan if passage could not be completed in a single season. By September, ice conditions worsened. The ships navigated southward into Peel Sound. Ice began to close around them more persistently. Progress slowed to cautious increments. Officers debated routes, weighing risks of pressing forward against safety, of finding secure anchorage for winter. Eventually, as daylight shortened and temperatures fell, the ships became beset in ice near King William Island. At first, Entrapment did not signal catastrophe. Arctic expeditions commonly overwintered. The expectation was that summer thaw would free the vessels. Preparations for winter began systematically. Snow walls were constructed around hulls to insulate against wind. Sails were furled securely. Decks were cleared of unnecessary equipment. Heating systems were activated to maintain livable interior temperatures. Inside, daily routine adjusted to confinement. Watches continued, though movement was restricted by surrounding ice. Meals were served on schedule. Officers organised lectures and readings to occupy evenings. The presence of books and musical instruments proved useful. Structure was maintained deliberately to prevent decline in morale. Outside, the Arctic entered its darker phase. By November, sunlight diminished sharply. For weeks at a time, twilight replaced day. Eventually, near total darkness settled, broken only by starlight and occasional aurora borealis shimmering overhead. The psychological weight of darkness was significant. Even disciplined sailors felt the monotony of confined space and limited visual change. Franklin and his officers emphasized routine as remedy. Men were assigned tasks, even when immediate necessity was minimal. Idleness was discouraged. Food supplies remained abundant. Canned provisions were opened regularly. Salted meat and preserved vegetables formed staple meals. Lime juice was distributed to prevent scurvy. On paper, nutritional needs were met. The ships themselves, reinforced and heated, performed as intended. Interiors remained warmer than on previous Arctic expeditions. The steam heating system reduced frost accumulation below decks. Carpenters inspected hull integrity periodically, ensuring no damage from shifting ice pressure. Interaction with Inuit communities during this first winter appears limited. The ship's position was remote. No sustained contact was recorded in early months. Cultural distance remained present, and reliance on European provisioning was complete. Franklin's leadership style during confinement emphasized calm continuity. He did not alter routine dramatically. His authority rested on steadiness. Crozier oversaw navigational observations, recording magnetic data even during winter. Scientific objectives continued where possible. The men adapted clothing further, adding fur garments for outside duties. Exercise was encouraged. Short excursions onto ice were organized to maintain physical strength. Officers were aware that inactivity could weaken bodies during prolonged winter. Yet beneath structure, subtle concerns emerged. Some men experienced early signs of illness. Arctic environments strain health in gradual ways. Minor ailments could escalate in isolation. The expedition's surgeon monitored conditions closely. By spring of 1846, anticipation of thaw grew. As daylight returned incrementally, optimism rose. The expectation remained that summer would free the ships and allow continued westward progress. When ice began to loosen slightly, attempts were made to maneuver. Steam engines were engaged carefully. Progress was limited. The ice had not fully retreated. Channels remained obstructed. Summer of 1846 did not bring release. Instead, the ships remained trapped, now more firmly embedded in ice south of their previous position. The realization that a second winter might be necessary began to settle gradually. This shift altered morale. Overwintering once had been planned. A second winter was less desirable but not unprecedented. Provisions remained sufficient on record, yet extended confinement increased strain. Environmental conditions fluctuated unpredictably. Some days brought relative calm. Others saw pressure ridges form as shifting ice compressed against hulls. The reinforced bows held, but vigilance increased. Health concerns grew subtly more visible. Symptoms that might once have been dismissed as fatigue persisted. The canned food, though abundant, did not provide fresh nutrients. The possibility of spoilage or contamination had not been fully considered. Officers maintained discipline. Naval codes allowed little space for overt complaint, yet extended isolation challenges even structured communities. Letters home could not be sent. No outside confirmation of well-being was possible. As 1846 drew toward its close, the ships remained immobilized. Franklin, now entering his second winter in ice during this expedition, faced circumstances different from his earlier experiences. Then, mobility had been regained after hardship. Now, ice appeared increasingly unyielding. The Arctic landscape offered no dramatic change. Snow covered ice. Darkness returned once more. Inside the ships, routines continued: meals, readings, observations. The difference lay in duration. Time stretched. Expectations adjusted. The hope that summer would guarantee release had weakened. The expedition had not encountered a single catastrophic event. There had been no storm destroying masts, no sudden hull breach. Instead, there was stillness, persistence of ice, and lengthening isolation. If one considers how discipline can sustain morale, one must also consider how duration tests it. The Franklin expedition was now entering a phase where preparation met limitation. When the second Arctic winter settled around Erebus and Terra, the difference from the first was not in temperature, nor in darkness, but in understanding. During the first winter, the men had believed they were pausing. During the second, they began to suspect they were fixed in place. By late 1846, the ships lay fast in ice off the northwest coast of King William Island. The sea around them had hardened into an uneven plain. Pressure ridges rose where floes collided. Snow covered the surface, smoothing sharp edges into deceptive calm. Inside the ships, routines continued with deliberate steadiness. Bells marked time as they always had. Officers maintained watches. Meals were served in sequence. The heating system functioned, circulating warmth below decks. In comparison with earlier Arctic expeditions, living conditions were relatively controlled. Yet health began to decline in subtle but unmistakable ways. Some sailors experienced persistent fatigue, others developed gastrointestinal discomfort. The expedition's surgeon, Dr. Stephen Stanley, monitored symptoms, though the underlying causes were not fully understood. Vitamin deficiencies could be mitigated by lime juice, but the effectiveness depended on regular distribution and storage quality. The canned food, once a symbol of innovation, now constituted the majority of daily sustenance. Tins were opened with routine regularity. Meat, preserved months earlier, was consumed without visible alarm. No immediate spoilage was apparent in most cases. Still, preservation standards of the time were inconsistent. The sealing process sometimes left traces of solder containing lead. The long-term effects were not known to the men who depended on those supplies. Daily work continued even without forward motion. Sailors cleared snow from decks. Carpenters inspected hull integrity. Engineers maintained the steam engines, though they were rarely used. Activity prevented stagnation, but it could not replace progress. Darkness returned in full by November. The sun dipped below the horizon and remained absent for weeks. Artificial light lamps fueled by oil illuminated narrow corridors below deck. The air inside grew heavy despite ventilation efforts. Frost formed in corners where warmth did not circulate evenly. Psychological strain accompanied physical hardship. Isolation from the world meant absence of news. In Victorian Britain, daily newspapers and correspondence structured awareness of events. Here, silence prevailed. The last confirmed contact had been with whalers in 1845. Now, more than a year had passed. Franklin's leadership during this period was marked by outward composure. He was not known for dramatic gestures. He relied on continuity, maintaining established routine, enforcing naval discipline, encouraging intellectual engagement. Officers organized lectures to occupy evenings. The small organ was played occasionally. These efforts were not trivial. They were intentional strategies to preserve morale. Crozier and Fitzjames continued scientific observations as conditions allowed. Magnetic measurements were recorded meticulously. Charts were updated based on exploratory walks across nearby terrain during brief daylight periods. These tasks reinforced purpose. The surrounding landscape remained austere. King William Island's coastline was rocky and low. There were no forests, only exposed ground during summer and snowbound expanses in winter. Hunting parties were occasionally dispatched to seek game seals, birds, but success was limited. European officers lacked the intimate seasonal knowledge that Inuit communities possessed. Contact with Inuit during this period appears to have been minimal or brief. Evidence from later testimony suggests that encounters occurred sporadically, but there was no sustained exchange that altered the expedition's trajectory. Cultural distance and language barriers limited cooperation. As winter deepened into 1847, illness intensified. Scurvy may have begun to manifest despite preventive measures. Lead exposure from tinned food, and possibly from shipboard water systems, has been suggested by modern analysis. At the time, symptoms presented gradually: weakness, cognitive dulling, digestive distress. Franklin himself did not escape decline. He was nearly 61. Arctic conditions taxed even younger men. Records left by survivors suggest that he died in June 1847, though exact cause remains uncertain. His death was noted later in a message left in a cairn, indicating the date but not the circumstances. The passing of the expedition's commander altered the balance aboard. Authority transferred to Crozier. Leadership continuity was maintained formally, but morale inevitably shifted. Franklin had represented continuity with British expectations. His absence was both personal and symbolic. By summer 1847, Thor once again failed to release the ships. Ice conditions remained stubborn. Attempts to free the vessels proved unsuccessful. The realization that they might not sail again grew more pronounced. Food supplies, though still present, were finite. 3 years of provisions had been calculated carefully. Yet, Extended confinement and potential spoilage introduced uncertainty. The health of the crew was not improving. More men fell ill. Some died during this period, though exact numbers remain debated. Crozier faced difficult decisions. Naval protocol favoured maintaining ships as long as possible. They provided shelter, storage, and relative safety. Yet immobility limited options. The Arctic was not merely cold, it was dynamic. Ice could crush hulls under sustained pressure. During the winter of 1847-1848, the expedition reached a critical psychological stage. Confidence in eventual release had eroded. Hope was not absent, but it was tempered by observation. The ice did not retreat sufficiently. The ships remained locked. Routine persisted as long as possible. Discipline was maintained, yet signs of decline multiplied. The surgeon's role became increasingly demanding. Supplies of fresh meat from hunting were insufficient to reverse nutritional deficiencies. The officers would have weighed options quietly. Abandoning ships was not undertaken lightly. Naval culture emphasized preservation of vessels, yet survival required adaptability. The Arctic landscape offered no clear guidance. There were no established settlements nearby. The nearest known trading posts were far to the south on the mainland. Reaching them would require overland travel across frozen terrain with limited resources. By April 1848, conditions had deteriorated to the point where a decisive choice was made. A written note later discovered indicated that the ships were abandoned on 22 April 1848. Crozier assumed command after Franklin's death and led 105 surviving officers and men toward the mainland. The first winter had tested patience. The second winter had tested endurance. Now, movement would test survival. The decision to leave Erebus and Terra marked a shift from structured confinement to uncertain migration. It acknowledged that preparation had limits. The reinforced hulls and steam engines had not delivered passage. The Arctic had imposed duration beyond expectation. As the men prepared to depart, they faced terrain largely unfamiliar. Sledges were loaded with provisions, boats mounted atop them for potential water crossings. Personal belongings were reduced to essentials. The ships, once symbols of confidence, were left embedded in ice. No dramatic storm forced abandonment. No sudden catastrophe compelled retreat. Instead, it was accumulation of illness, of immobility, of time. The Franklin expedition, conceived in optimism and prepared with care, had reached a turning point defined not by spectacle but by quiet necessity. When the men stepped down from Erebus and Terra in April 1848, they were not leaving in panic. The decision had been recorded formally, written and sealed within a cairn message. It stated the date, the death of Sir John Franklin the previous June, and the intention of 105 survivors to march south toward the Back River on the Canadian mainland. The tone was restrained. It conveyed order rather than desperation. Yet the reality outside the ships was austere. The ice still extended across the sea, though daylight had returned and temperatures were beginning to moderate slightly. Snow lay unevenly across ridges formed by years of pressure. The men prepared sledges loaded with supplies. Small boats were mounted atop these sledges in case open water interrupted their path. Each man carried clothing suitable for cold travel: wool layers, heavy coats, fur caps, mittens. Yet they were naval sailors, not nomadic hunters. Their experience lay on decks and within hulls, not in long-distance overland migration across frozen terrain. The decision to march south reflected calculation. The Back River, flowing toward the Arctic coast, offered potential route to known trading posts and settlements farther inland. If reached, it might provide access to resources and assistance. The distance, however, was considerable, hundreds of miles across unfamiliar land. Daily life changed immediately. Routine bells and structured watches disappeared. Instead, movement depended on weather and physical strength. The sledges were heavy. Despite efforts to reduce load, Officers chose to carry certain items reflecting both necessity and habit. Later discoveries would reveal that some non-essential objects, books, even silverware, had been transported for a time. These choices suggested that discipline and cultural habits persisted even under strain. Travel over ice required coordination. Teams pulled sledges across uneven surfaces. Progress was slow. Wind could chill, exposed skin rapidly. Breaks were frequent but brief, as lingering in cold increased fatigue. Health continued to decline among many of the men. Symptoms of scurvy likely impaired mobility. Lead exposure, if present, may have affected judgment and stamina. Malnutrition weakened muscles. Each mile gained demanded disproportionate effort. As they moved along the western coast of King William Island, the men likely encountered Inuit hunters sporadically. Later Inuit testimony described groups of European sailors dragging boats across ice, appearing thin and exhausted. Cultural barriers limited communication. The British expedition had not integrated indigenous survival techniques into its planning, and now they faced conditions that Inuit communities navigated with knowledge developed over generations. The officers attempted to maintain hierarchy. Crozier remained in command. Orders were given and followed as strength allowed, yet physical decline blurred distinctions. When illness reduces endurance, rank does not restore it. Spring conditions fluctuated. Some days brought relative calm, others introduced biting wind. Snow cover could obscure crevasses. Sea ice near shore was uneven and unpredictable. The sledges, burdened with supplies, strained men already weakened by months of confinement. As they reached the southern tip of King William Island, the terrain shifted toward tundra and rocky ground. Ice gave way, intermittently, to exposed earth. Movement required adjustment. The boats mounted on sledges would eventually prove cumbersome, but abandoning them meant relinquishing potential lifelines if waterways became navigable. Food supplies dwindled steadily. Rations were likely reduced to extend duration. Hunting opportunities were limited by lack of familiarity with terrain, and perhaps by weakened condition. Ammunition was finite. Records from later search expeditions would uncover scattered artefacts along this route. Clothing fragments, bones, equipment. These traces suggested gradual attrition rather than sudden collapse. Some men likely died along the path and were buried or left behind when burial proved impossible. Crozier faced increasingly constrained choices. Continuing south meant enduring exhaustion. Returning to the ships meant returning to confinement without improvement. Pressing forward offered uncertain hope. Victorian naval culture emphasized endurance under hardship, yet overland survival demanded skills beyond discipline. Inuit practices building snow shelters quickly, travelling light, adjusting diet, were not fully adopted. The British method favoured carrying structured supplies and maintaining formal organisation. As weeks passed, cohesion diminished. The group may have divided into smaller parties based on strength. Inuit accounts suggest that some sailors attempted to travel inland, while others remained near the coast. By summer 1848, open water would have begun to appear along shorelines. The boats, once dragged over ice, may have been launched in brief attempts to navigate rivers or coastal channels. However, weakened condition and unfamiliar currents limited effectiveness. The landscape offered little relief. There were no established settlements, no cultivated fields, no reliable landmarks recognizable from European charts. The Arctic interior was vast and indifferent. For the men, daily life became a sequence of exertion, rest, and diminishing resources. Conversations likely centered on immediate concerns: distance covered, remaining provisions, physical capability. The broader objective of completing the Northwest Passage had receded entirely. Survival was now singular focus. Inuit testimony collected years later described seeing emaciated sailors, some collapsing, others requesting assistance through gestures. Cultural misunderstanding limited aid. Inuit communities had limited surplus to offer and may have been cautious in engaging with unfamiliar outsiders. The march toward the back river did not achieve its intended outcome. No survivor reached established trading posts. Bones later discovered along the route indicated that many perished near the mouth of the river or along its banks. There was no single climactic confrontation with environment. Instead, there was accumulation weakness layered upon weakness, distance layered upon distance. Back in Britain, none of this was yet known. The ships had departed in confidence. Silence had been anticipated only temporarily. Families awaited letters expected after 1 or 2 winters. On the ice and tundra, however, time had narrowed. Each decision consumed energy that could not be replenished fully. Supplies calculated for 3 years aboard ships did not translate easily into mobile sustenance across frozen terrain. Crozier's leadership under these circumstances remains partially obscured. No detailed journals from this final march survive. The Cairn note provides structure but not narrative. Later archaeological evidence fills gaps imperfectly. The Franklin expedition, conceived as demonstration of preparation and endurance, had transformed into a struggle against limits of body and planning. The Arctic did not defeat them through sudden violence. It wore them down. By late 1848 or early 1849, the organised march had dissolved. Individuals or small groups likely attempted survival independently. Their traces remained scattered across King William Island and adjacent mainland. While the surviving men struggled southward across ice and tundra, Britain remained unaware. In London, Liverpool, and smaller port towns, daily life proceeded with the assumption that Franklin's expedition was delayed, but not lost. Arctic voyages commonly required 2 or 3 years. Silence at first did not signify disaster. By late 1847, however, unease began to surface. The expected window for a successful passage had closed. No letters had arrived. No whaling ships reported fresh sightings. The Admiralty monitored reports quietly, reviewing routes and calculating timelines. In Victorian society, communication shaped perception. Newspapers carried brief notices about the expedition's progress or lack thereof. Editors reassured readers that Arctic travel involved long intervals without news. Confidence in Franklin's preparation remained intact publicly. Families of officers and sailors experienced uncertainty more personally. Lady Jane Franklin maintained composure outwardly but sought information persistently. She corresponded with Admiralty officials, requesting updates and urging contingency planning. Her determination would later influence search efforts significantly. The political climate in Britain during the late 1840s was not dominated by Arctic concerns. Ireland faced famine. European revolutions stirred unrest. Domestic reforms occupied parliamentary debate. Yet the Franklin expedition remained symbolically important. It represented British endurance and scientific ambition. By 1848, with no confirmed communication, the Admiralty began to consider search expeditions. Initial plans were cautious. It was assumed that Franklin might be overwintering voluntarily, awaiting favourable ice conditions. Dispatching relief too early risked unnecessary expenditure. Economic considerations influenced timing. Mounting large-scale search operations required ships, crews, and supplies. Nonetheless, public interest increased steadily. Newspapers began to question the prolonged silence. Illustrations of icebound ships reappeared in print. Lady Jane Franklin played a pivotal role. She advocated tirelessly for search missions. Her letters appealed not only to duty, but to national honour. In Victorian society, a devoted wife's appeal carried moral weight. She framed the search as obligation rather than speculation. The Admiralty eventually authorised multiple search expeditions beginning in 1848 and 1849. Ships were dispatched via different routes through Lancaster Sound, via the Pacific through Bering Strait, and overland from Hudson Bay. These efforts reflected both determination and uncertainty about Franklin's possible location. The searchers themselves faced similar Arctic challenges. They navigated ice-choked waters, wintered in remote anchorages, and endured prolonged darkness. Yet their mission differed. They sought traces rather than passage. As search expeditions spread across the Arctic archipelago, they encountered scattered evidence, abandoned camps, fragments of equipment, occasional graves from earlier voyages. However, for several years, no definitive trace of Franklin's party emerged. Public discourse shifted gradually. Confidence in survival diminished. Speculation increased. Some suggested that the ships might have been crushed by ice. Others proposed that Franklin had discovered the passage but remained trapped. Scientific societies discussed potential routes and ice patterns. Magnetic observations from other expeditions provided incremental data, but no direct answers. Maps were updated cautiously, incorporating findings from search vessels. Back on King William Island, the final stages of the expedition left little written record. The Cairn message, discovered later in 1859 by the McClintock expedition, would confirm key details: Franklin's death in June 1847 and abandonment of the ships in April 1848. Until that discovery, the sequence remained unknown. Inuit testimony collected by searchers provided fragments. Accounts described groups of starving white men dragging boats, camps with abandoned utensils, and evidence of bodies along the coast. Some reports included references to cannibalism among desperate survivors. Victorian society struggled to process such claims. They conflicted with ideals of disciplined endurance. Debate arose about the reliability of Inuit accounts. Cultural bias influenced interpretation. Some British observers questioned credibility. Others recognized that Inuit witnesses possessed direct experience of the region. As the 1850s progressed, multiple search expeditions continued. The Arctic became increasingly mapped through these efforts. Ironically, the attempt to locate Franklin expanded geographic knowledge beyond what his own voyage might have achieved. In 1854, Dr. John Ray, travelling overland, gathered testimony from Inuit hunters who reported finding bodies and artefacts from the lost expedition. Ray relayed reports suggesting cannibalism. His findings reached Britain and sparked controversy. Lady Jane Franklin and supporters resisted acceptance of such details, viewing them as incompatible with naval honour. The tension revealed broader Victorian values. Reputation mattered deeply. The idea that disciplined British sailors might resort to desperate measures challenged cultural assumptions about moral fortitude. Scientific evidence and national identity intersected uneasily. In 1859, Captain Francis McClintock's privately funded expedition, supported by Lady Jane Franklin, discovered the crucial Cairn note on King William Island. It provided the first official confirmation of abandonment and Franklin's death. McClintock also found skeletal remains and relics along the southern coast, corroborating Inuit accounts of a failed march. These discoveries clarified the outline, but not every detail. Questions remained about cause of death, sequence of events, and internal dynamics during the final months. By then, more than a decade had passed since the ship's departure. Britain had changed in subtle ways. Industrial growth continued. Political debates evolved, yet the Franklin expedition remained part of national conversation. Memorials were erected. Franklin was commemorated as a hero who died in service of discovery. The narrative emphasized perseverance rather than failure. The Northwest Passage itself would eventually be navigated decades later, though not under Franklin's command. The search expeditions left their own legacy. They charted extensive Arctic coastline. They refined understanding of ice behavior and survival strategies. Lessons learned influenced later polar exploration. For families of the lost men, closure came gradually and incompletely. Some accepted official accounts. Others continued to hope for alternative explanations. The Franklin expedition had begun as measured extension of British capability. Its aftermath revealed limits not only of preparation but of perception. Technology and discipline had not guaranteed control over environment. By the time McClintock discovered the Cairn note in 1859, More than 14 years had passed since Erebus and Terror sailed from England. The document, found within a stone cairn on King William Island, provided the clearest surviving outline of the expedition's final organised moments. It confirmed Franklin's death on 11 June 1847. It recorded that 105 officers and men had abandoned the ships on 22 April 1848 under Captain Crozier's command. It did not explain what followed. The discovery altered the nature of discussion in Britain. The question was no longer whether the expedition was lost, it was how it had ended and what that ending meant. Public memorials had already begun to appear before definitive confirmation. Statues were commissioned. Inscriptions praised courage and devotion. The narrative emphasized perseverance and noble sacrifice. Victorian culture valued dignity in adversity, and Franklin's image was shaped accordingly. Yet the accumulating evidence from Arctic searches complicated that image. Inuit testimony described weakened men, camps with abandoned goods, and skeletal remains along the coast. Ray's earlier reports of cannibalism, once contested, now seemed more plausible in light of physical evidence. Some bones bore cut marks consistent with attempts to extract marrow. For Victorian society, the implication was unsettling. Cannibalism was associated with savagery in prevailing European thought. The possibility that disciplined naval sailors had resorted to such measures challenged assumptions about moral hierarchy. Debate unfolded in newspapers and scientific circles. Lady Jane Franklin remained central in shaping public perception. She resisted narratives that diminished her husband's honour. Her advocacy ensured that official memory emphasized devotion and endurance rather than desperation. Her efforts were not solely emotional. They reflected cultural expectations of loyalty and reputation. Scientific analysis of relics began gradually. Naval officers examined recovered equipment, noting signs of heavy wear. Archaeological interpretation, though less developed than in later centuries, attempted to reconstruct movement patterns based on scattered artefacts. The Arctic environment had preserved many objects, but also obscured context. Ice movement and seasonal thaw could displace items from original positions. Searchers had to infer sequences from limited data. In Britain, exploration continued beyond the Franklin story. Other Arctic voyages sought both geographic knowledge and validation of endurance. The Northwest Passage would eventually be navigated fully by Roald Amundsen in the early 20th century, using smaller vessels and incorporating indigenous knowledge more deliberately. That later success underscored the limitations of earlier methods. Within the Royal Navy, reflection occurred quietly. The Franklin expedition had been well provisioned and reinforced. Its failure suggested that technological confidence alone could not guarantee success in polar conditions. Lessons about flexibility, nutrition, and reliance on local expertise gained attention over time. Medical inquiry into potential causes of decline evolved slowly. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, analysis of exhumed remains indicated high levels of lead in some sailors' bones. The source may have been tinned food solder or shipboard water systems. Such findings suggested that unseen environmental factors compounded hardship. Economic context in Britain during the expedition's aftermath continued to shift. Industrialization intensified. Urban populations grew. Empire expanded further into Africa and Asia. The Arctic no longer held the same central symbolic importance, yet it remained part of national identity. For the families of ordinary sailors, commemoration was quieter. Names engraved on memorials stood for lives interrupted. Wages ceased. Grief persisted without detailed knowledge of final moments. The Franklin expedition thus moved from event to memory. Its meaning evolved. Initially framed as bold endeavour, it became a cautionary tale about overconfidence and environmental limits. At the same time, it contributed substantially to Arctic mapping through the extensive search operations it inspired. Archaeological work in the 20th and 21st centuries added further layers. Wrecks of Erebus and Terror were eventually located beneath Arctic waters in 2014 and 2016, preserved in cold depths. Artefacts recovered from these wrecks, personal belongings, instruments, even dishes, provided intimate glimpses into daily life aboard. These discoveries reinforced earlier conclusions while also correcting misconceptions. The ships had not been crushed immediately. They had drifted or been abandoned in complex sequences. Preservation allowed historians to reconstruct aspects of shipboard routine with greater clarity. Yet even with modern technology, not every question has been answered. Exact causes of death for many remain uncertain. The sequence of the final march cannot be mapped precisely. Individual experiences are inferred from fragments. If one reflects on the broader arc, the Franklin expedition illustrates interplay between ambition and environment. Victorian Britain believed in methodical progress. The Arctic imposed conditions resistant to straightforward solutions. The men who sailed were neither reckless nor naive. They were products of disciplined institutions and cultural optimism. Their preparation was thorough by contemporary standards. Their endurance during 2 winters in ice was substantial. The tragedy unfolded not through a single misjudgment, but through cumulative constraints, extended entrapment, declining health, and terrain unsuited to European survival strategies. Back in Britain, the expedition's story became part of educational curriculum, literature, and public memory. It influenced how future explorers approached polar regions. Greater attention was paid to nutrition, mobility, and indigenous expertise. In this way, loss generated knowledge. The Arctic remained formidable, but understanding of its demands deepened. The Cairn note, brief and factual, remains central. It contains no dramatic language. It records dates and decisions. Its restraint reflects naval habit, clarity without embellishment. The act of abandoning Erebus and Terror was not carried out in haste. It unfolded over days of deliberate preparation, each movement signalling the end of one kind of existence and the uncertain beginning of another. For nearly 3 years, the ships had been shelter, storehouse, and structure. To step away from them required more than physical effort. It required relinquishing the last fixed point of order. Inside the hulls, decisions were translated into lists. What could be carried? What must be left behind? Naval training favoured completeness, yet the reality of sled travel demanded reduction. Provisions were repacked into portable quantities. Flour and biscuit were measured into sacks. Tinned goods were selected in numbers thought sufficient but manageable. Ammunition was counted and distributed. The boats mounted on sledges were central to planning. They were heavy, built for durability rather than lightness. Each was placed atop a wooden sledge frame, designed to be dragged across ice. If open water appeared along the coast or within river channels, these boats might provide passage. To abandon them would mean surrendering mobility and thaw. To carry them meant slower progress. Officers retained instruments where possible. A sextant might still offer navigational guidance if skies cleared. Compasses were packed carefully. Even as circumstances shifted from exploration to survival, habits of measurement persisted. Clothing was adjusted for overland movement. Sea boots were ill-suited to long marches over uneven ice and tundra. Fur-lined garments, accumulated during winters, became essential. Blankets were rolled tightly. Personal effects were minimized, though later discoveries would show that some items, books, writing materials, small domestic objects were initially taken. Such choices reflected not frivolity, but the difficulty of imagining complete severance from familiar order. The ships themselves were secured as if temporarily vacated. Hatches were closed. Equipment was stowed. There was no sign that they were intentionally destroyed or dismantled. The expectation may have remained that one day they could be reoccupied, should conditions allow. When the men formed their columns upon the ice, the group was smaller than the original complement. Deaths during the winters had already reduced numbers. Those remaining faced varying degrees of strength. Some were visibly weakened, others retained more stamina. Crozier, now commander, organized the march with naval clarity. Ranks were preserved insofar as bodies permitted. The first stages of travel required coordination across unstable surfaces. Ice near the ships bore scars of pressure ridges accumulated over 2 seasons. Sledges had to be guided through narrow corridors between hummocks. Progress was measured in short increments rather than miles. Each day's march was structured around light and weather. In April, daylight extended, though cold persisted. Men leaned into harnesses attached to sledges, pulling in rhythm. When wind intensified, faces were shielded with scarves and fur-lined caps. Communication was practical gestures, brief exchanges, commands given concisely. Rest periods were limited. Sitting too long invited chill that penetrated clothing. Camps were established when necessary using tents carried from the ships. Snow blocks might be arranged as windbreaks. Fires were small, fueled by carried supplies or limited driftwood where found. The landscapes south of their winter anchorage presented alternating expanses of flat sea ice and rising coastal terrain. The western shore of King William Island offered rocky ground exposed in patches as spring advanced. Transitioning from ice to land altered the physical demand. Sledges bumped over stone and uneven soil, requiring lifting rather than sliding. Food consumption during these early days remained structured. Rations were distributed according to calculation rather than appetite. Yet physical exertion increased caloric need. The tension between conservation and sustenance grew immediately. The boat's weight proved burdensome. Each required multiple men to maneuver, particularly when ridges interrupted smooth paths. There may have been moments when the wisdom of carrying them was questioned silently. Still, relinquishing them meant discarding a planned contingency. As the column advanced, evidence of prior winter confinement lingered only behind them. The ships receded from view, eventually obscured by distance and curvature of ice. With that disappearance, the last visible connection to the Admiralty's design faded. Psychologically, departure altered perception of time. Aboard ship, days were counted by routine and calendar. On the march, time was measured by distance achieved and physical depletion. The cairn message left behind had fixed a date in record. What followed would not be recorded formally again. Encounters with Inuit during this phase were brief and limited. Later accounts describe small groups observing the marching sailors from a distance. Communication relied on gestures and limited shared vocabulary. Trade, if any occurred, would have been constrained by the British party's limited goods and Inuit communities' own subsistence needs. The men's naval training emphasized unity, yet physical decline does not distribute evenly. Those strongest likely bore greater load. Those weakened may have required assistance. Such imbalance introduces strain not through conflict but through inevitability. As they rounded the southern tip of King William Island, open water appeared intermittently. The boats, once dragged across solid ice, were lowered in attempts to navigate leads or coastal stretches. Launching required coordinated effort. Water near freezing temperature posed additional risk. Paddling or rowing demanded energy already in short supply. The coastline offered no settlements recognizable to European eyes. It presented low tundra, gravel beaches and distant hills. Game might have been present in small numbers, but hunting success required knowledge of patterns and patience. The march southward likely fragmented over time. Some men may have fallen behind. Decisions about whether to wait or proceed would have confronted Crozier repeatedly. Naval codes provide guidance for maintaining formation, but overland survival challenges strict adherence. Material evidence discovered decades later indicates that equipment was gradually discarded along the route. Heavy items, perhaps initially considered necessary, became liabilities. The presence of silverware and other domestic objects among relics suggests that understanding of necessity evolved painfully. Weather conditions fluctuated unpredictably. Early thaw created slush that slowed sledges. Refreezing at night hardened surfaces unevenly. Each environmental shift required adjustment. At some point along the western coast or near the mouth of the Back River, the organized column dissolved. The precise moment remains uncertain. Skeletal remains discovered in dispersed locations suggest that individuals or small groups attempted to continue independently when collective progress faltered. The decision to abandon the ships had been rational within the constraints of the moment. Remaining aboard offered diminishing returns. Moving offered uncertain hope. Neither choice guaranteed survival. What is striking in the material record is the absence of dramatic destruction. There is no evidence of mutiny, no sign of deliberate sabotage. The progression appears cumulative weakness, attrition, dispersal. The boats, central to initial planning, were found far inland in some cases, suggesting that at least for a time, the men persisted in carrying them beyond immediate utility. Such persistence reflects commitment to contingency, even when circumstances narrowed. In leaving Erebus and Terra, the men carried with them more than supplies. They carried habits of order, expectations of hierarchy, and faith in measured action. The Arctic did not respond to these with hostility. It simply remained indifferent. The abandonment marked the end of the expedition as structured naval enterprise. What followed was movement without certainty of destination. The back river lay ahead, but reaching it required endurance that was already diminishing. The ships, left embedded in ice, would remain silent witnesses for years to come. Their cabins preserved in cold darkness, while those who had lived within them struggled across exposed land. Once the organized column began to fragment, the character of the expedition changed entirely. What had started as a unified march under Crozier's direction became a series of diminishing attempts to continue southward. The Arctic landscape did not shift dramatically during this phase. It remained open, windswept, and largely featureless. What changed was the capacity of the men moving across it. Archaeological discoveries made more than a century later suggest that some sailors reached the vicinity of the back river. Skeletal remains found near its mouth indicate that at least part of the group advanced that far. Yet no evidence confirms that any reached established trading posts farther inland. The river, though a logical objective on maps, was not an assured corridor to safety. Its banks were rugged, and seasonal conditions varied sharply. The daily experience of those final travellers can only be inferred. Their clothing, heavy and damp from thawing snow, would have weighed against already weakened bodies. Rations, reduced to extend supply, likely provided insufficient energy for sustained exertion. Scurvy, characterized by swollen gums, joint pain, and weakness, may have impaired mobility further. If lead exposure had contributed to illness, cognitive clarity and coordination would also have suffered. The Arctic spring, often imagined as gentle renewal, offered little relief. Snow melted unevenly, exposing muddy ground beneath. Slush formed where ice weakened. Movement across such terrain required constant adjustment. Sledges, once gliding over hard surfaces, now dragged through resistance. The boats that had seemed prudent at departure became burdensome. Evidence suggests that at least one boat was abandoned along the way, found later resting on a sledge with supplies inside. The presence of silver spoons and other domestic objects among recovered artefacts has often been remarked upon. Such items may have been retained at first as part of officers' personal kits. Their eventual abandonment demonstrates how priorities shifted gradually rather than abruptly. It is difficult to discard familiar objects until necessity compels it. Inuit testimony collected by later searchers provides glimpses into this stage. Accounts described small groups of white men travelling separately, some collapsing, others seeking assistance. In one instance, Inuit observers reportedly discovered a camp containing bodies and signs that flesh had been cut from bones. These details, though uncomfortable, align with physical evidence examined decades later. Cannibalism, if it occurred, did not represent moral collapse so much as biological extremity. Starvation narrows choices severely. Victorian society struggled to reconcile such acts with ideals of discipline and honour. Yet the Arctic does not conform to social categories. It imposes conditions under which survival instinct overrides convention. Crozier's own fate remains uncertain. No document records his final moments. It is possible that he travelled with a smaller group, perhaps attempting to follow the back river inland. His prior Arctic experience would have informed decisions, but physical decline spares no rank. The dispersal of remains across a wide area suggests that the final phase unfolded over weeks or months rather than days. Some men may have paused in makeshift camps, hoping to regain strength. Others may have attempted solitary movement when collective travel proved too slow. The economic logic that once motivated the expedition finding a shorter trade route had vanished entirely from consideration. Survival was the only objective, and even that became increasingly tenuous. Weather patterns during late 1848 and early 1849 are not recorded in detail, but Arctic variability implies alternating freeze and thaw cycles. Such conditions complicate travel and increase risk of injury. Frostbite, infection, and dehydration may have compounded malnutrition. Back in Britain, concern had grown but not yet resolved into certainty. Search expeditions were underway, but none had reached the precise locations where survivors lingered. The vastness of the Arctic archipelago meant that small groups could remain unseen despite concerted effort. The contrast between British expectation and Arctic reality widened during this period. At home, the expedition was discussed in drawing rooms and newspapers as an enterprise delayed. In the north, individuals faced incremental failure of body and resource. Material evidence indicates that at least some of the men attempted to return northward at a later stage. Artefacts found closer to the ship suggest possible reversal of direction by a subset of survivors. Whether this represented strategic reconsideration or disorientation remains unknown. The absence of written records from this final phase leaves historians dependent on archaeology and Inuit accounts. Bones bearing cut marks were analysed with increasing scientific rigour in the 20th century. Patterns of distribution along the coast and river corridors provide clues but not complete narrative. Inuit communities, observing from their own seasonal cycles, incorporated sightings of the starving sailors into oral tradition. Their perspective was pragmatic. They described emaciated foreigners struggling against terrain familiar to them. Assistance was limited by resources and caution. The Franklin expedition had been designed as self-sufficient naval endeavour. Its failure during overland migration underscores the gap between maritime planning and terrestrial survival in polar regions. By the time the last individuals succumbed, whether to starvation, illness, exposure, or injury, the organised structure of the expedition had dissolved entirely. There were no formal logs, no final collective message. The Arctic absorbed their traces gradually. Snow-covered camps, ice-shifted artefacts, animals scattered bones, cold preserved fragments that would later be found. For years, the precise route and sequence remained speculative. Searchers found relics but not survivors. The ships themselves, abandoned and drifting within ice, remained undiscovered until the 21st century. The end did not arrive in spectacle. It arrived in attrition. Each decision narrowed possibility. Each mile required energy that could not be replaced fully. What began as demonstration of Victorian preparedness concluded as reminder that environment can outlast intention. The Arctic did not defeat the expedition through singular catastrophe. It required persistence beyond human endurance. Long before British ships pressed into the channels of the Canadian Arctic, Inuit communities had lived within that landscape for generations. Their knowledge was not recorded in admiralty charts, but it existed in practice, embedded in seasonal migration routes, hunting strategies, and memory of ice behaviour. When Franklin's men entered this world, they did so carrying a different system of understanding. Inuit life in the mid-19th century was structured around mobility and adaptation. Winter shelters were constructed from snow blocks or sod. Clothing was sewn from caribou and seal skins, designed for insulation and flexibility. Food sources followed predictable seasonal rhythms. Seals in winter through breathing holes in ice. Caribou inland during migration. Fish and birds during summer. European explorers often regarded the Arctic as empty space, punctuated by hardship. For Inuit communities, it was inhabited terrain shaped by practical familiarity. Navigation relied on landmarks, snowdrift patterns, and inherited knowledge rather than instruments alone. When Inuit hunters encountered small groups of starving sailors along King William Island and the mainland coast, they observed strangers operating outside established survival norms. The British wore heavy wool and naval uniforms not optimized for long overland travel. They hauled large boats across terrain where lighter sleds would have sufficed. Communication between the two groups was limited. Shared vocabulary was minimal. Gestures conveyed immediate needs, food, direction, but deeper exchange was constrained. Inuit communities had their own resource limitations. They could not sustain large numbers of additional mouths without jeopardizing their own survival. Later testimony, gathered by search expeditions in the 1850s, provides the primary record of these encounters. Inuit informants described groups of approximately 30 to 40 white men at one point, dragging boats southward. Some were reported as having collapsed along the route, others appeared disoriented. One account described a large tent containing bodies, with evidence that flesh had been removed from bones. This testimony, corroborated in part by archaeological findings, became central to debates in Britain about the expedition's final stage. The Inuit perspective was observational rather than judgmental. They described what they saw: men weakened by hunger, equipment scattered, boats left on sledges. They reported that some of the sailors died near the mouth of a river, likely the Back River. They did not frame these events within European notions of honour or disgrace. Searchers such as John Ray relied heavily on Inuit information to reconstruct probable routes. Ray's willingness to credit indigenous testimony contrasted with scepticism expressed by others in Britain. Cultural bias influenced reception. Some British commentators doubted Inuit accounts, preferring to imagine alternative outcomes. Yet without Inuit guidance, search efforts would have been less effective. Indigenous knowledge of coastline and seasonal conditions enabled search parties to navigate efficiently. Over time, British explorers incorporated more of this knowledge into Arctic strategy. The relationship between the Franklin expedition and Inuit communities thus reveals a broader pattern within imperial exploration. European ventures often underestimated local expertise. Only after hardship or loss did reliance increase. Daily life for Inuit families during this period continued according to established patterns. They hunted, migrated, and maintained social structures shaped by kinship and cooperation. Encounters with starving sailors were interruptions within a larger rhythm. From their perspective, the British ships themselves were extraordinary objects, large wooden structures embedded in ice. Later, Inuit testimony mentioned one of the ships being seen upright, possibly drifting after abandonment. Artefacts were sometimes salvaged metal, wood, tools, valuable materials in a region where such resources were scarce. These interactions were not framed as rescue operations. They were exchanges shaped by circumstance and capacity. Inuit communities lacked the infrastructure to sustain or transport large numbers of Europeans to distant posts. As British search expeditions intensified during the 1850s, relationships between Inuit and European explorers evolved. Searchers sought information actively. Gifts and trade goods facilitated dialogue. Gradually, Inuit testimony was recorded systematically. The broader political climate in Britain during these years included increasing awareness of colonial encounters worldwide. Arctic interactions formed part of that pattern, though less visibly than conflicts elsewhere in the empire. For the Franklin expedition, Inuit testimony provided the most credible reconstruction of final movements. Without it, the cairn note would have stood isolated, indicating only abandonment and intended direction. Archaeological investigations in later centuries confirmed many elements of these accounts. Human remains found along the coast and river corridor aligned with reported sightings. Cut marks on bones supported descriptions of extreme measures taken in starvation. The Arctic thus preserved two narratives, one written briefly in English on a cairn message, the other spoken orally in Inuit communities. Together, they form a composite understanding of what occurred. The Franklin expedition had entered a landscape already inhabited and understood by others. Its failure underscores not only environmental limits but also cultural distance. If earlier sections of the story reflect Victorian confidence in technology and order, this stage reveals the importance of localized knowledge and adaptive practice. While fragments of the Franklin expedition were being encountered along Arctic shores, Britain experienced a different kind of endurance, one measured not in miles, but in waiting. The years following 1845 brought no definitive message. The absence of letters gradually transformed from inconvenience to anxiety. In London, Admiralty officials tracked time according to planned contingencies. 3 years of provisions had been loaded aboard Erebus and Terror. It was therefore reasonable, at first, to assume that silence until 1848 or even 1849 might indicate little more than overwintering. Yet as seasons passed without contact, the calculation shifted. Victorian society depended on correspondence. Families maintained ties across empire through regular letters. News from India, Africa, or Australia travelled slowly but predictably. The Arctic differed. Once ships entered northern waters, communication ceased entirely until return. This created a vacuum filled easily by speculation. Lady Jane Franklin emerged as central figure during these years. Her response combined personal loyalty with strategic advocacy. She wrote to officials, lobbied politicians, and cultivated public interest. Her efforts ensured that the expedition did not fade quietly from national attention. Newspapers began to publish editorials questioning Admiralty restraint. Illustrations of Arctic scenes reappeared, reminding readers of the expedition's mission. Public sympathy gathered around the families of the lost men. The narrative shifted from confident expectation to collective concern. The broader political landscape of the late 1840s complicated focus. Ireland was in the grip of famine. European revolutions unsettled monarchies. Domestic reforms occupied parliamentary debate. Yet the Franklin story persisted as symbol of national resolve and uncertainty. Search expeditions launched beginning in 1848 were reported with cautious optimism. Each new departure generated renewed hope. Ships under commanders such as James Clark Ross, Edward Belcher, and others sailed north, retracing likely routes and wintering in harsh conditions themselves. These searchers faced many of the same environmental constraints as Franklin's party. They too experienced prolonged darkness and confinement. Their task, however, was narrower. Locate traces, rescue survivors if possible. Reports returning from these expeditions offered partial information but no final answer. Abandoned camps from earlier Arctic voyages were found. Coastlines were mapped more precisely. The absence of evidence from Franklin's ships became increasingly ominous. For families of ordinary sailors, the waiting period was prolonged and painful. Wages ceased when men were declared lost. Some families petitioned for financial assistance. Charitable funds were established in certain cases. The Royal Navy, as institution, provided limited support within existing frameworks. Public discourse during this period balanced reverence and uncertainty. Franklin's earlier achievements were recalled. His leadership was praised. Yet underlying questions grew. Had preparation been insufficient? Had risk been misjudged? Lady Jane Franklin's influence ensured that hope remained visible. She financed and supported additional search missions, including the Voyage led by McClintock. Her advocacy extended beyond private grief. It became public campaign. In cultural terms, the Franklin expedition became story told in lecture halls and printed in serialized accounts. Artists depicted icebound ships under pale skies. Poets referenced polar endurance. The Arctic, once distant, entered popular imagination more fully. The economic life of Britain continued its rapid transformation. Railways expanded, telegraph lines began connecting cities. News travelled faster across land even as it failed to arrive from the north. This contrast intensified the sense of isolation surrounding the expedition. When Dr. John Ray returned in 1854 with Inuit testimony indicating starvation and possible cannibalism, public reaction was divided. Some accepted the evidence as pragmatic truth. Others rejected it as incompatible with national character. Debate unfolded not only about events, but about identity. The Admiralty's official response remained measured. They continued to support search efforts while avoiding definitive statements. Memorialization of Franklin as heroic figure proceeded even without complete knowledge. By the time McClintock's expedition discovered the Cairn Note in 1859, waiting had stretched into 14 years. The message provided clarity but not comfort. It confirmed death and abandonment, but left final days unrecorded. Public mourning crystallized at that point. Memorials were dedicated formally. Franklin was commemorated in Westminster Abbey. His name became synonymous with Arctic exploration. The families of the other 128 men received less attention individually. Their names were recorded in lists and inscriptions, yet personal stories remained largely absent from public narrative. Their lives had been shaped by naval routine and economic necessity as much as by exploration. The Franklin expedition's absence had influenced British policy subtly. Greater emphasis was placed on search and rescue planning for future voyages. Nutritional science advanced gradually, informed partly by polar experiences. Waiting had transformed perception. What began as anticipated triumph became extended uncertainty and then confirmed loss. The interval between departure and discovery shaped national memory. When Captain Francis Leopold McClintock stepped ashore on King William Island in 1859 and discovered the Cairn message left by Crozier and Fitzjames, the long period of conjecture narrowed into documented fact. The brief note, written first in 1847 and amended in 1848, confirmed two crucial realities. Sir John Franklin had died nearly a year before abandonment, and the ships had been left after more than 20 months trapped in ice. McClintock's expedition, privately funded in large part by Lady Jane Franklin, represented persistence beyond official channels. By that time, numerous Admiralty search missions had charted vast sections of the Arctic archipelago. The geography that Franklin had hoped to complete was now better understood, precisely because of the search for him. McClintock and his men traced relics along the southern coast of King William Island. They found a boat mounted on a sledge containing silverware engraved with officers' names, Bibles, clothing, and personal items. These artefacts suggested that, for a time, the survivors had clung to structured identity even while marching toward uncertain survival. The condition of the boat and contents offered further clues. It appeared to have been dragged inland, not left at the shoreline. Inside were skeletal remains of 2 men. The accumulation of items indicated gradual reduction of necessity rather than immediate catastrophe. Heavy possessions had not been discarded instantly. They were relinquished as strength failed. Elsewhere along the coast, McClintock's party located graves and scattered bones. Some remains were buried intentionally, others lay exposed. The distribution supported Inuit testimony describing multiple small groups rather than a single unified column in the final stages. Search expeditions over the previous decade had not been futile. They had mapped coastlines from multiple approaches. Islands previously uncertain on charts were confirmed. Channels were documented in greater detail. Ironically, Franklin's loss accelerated geographic knowledge of the very region he sought to navigate. In Britain, the publication of McClintock's findings was received with solemn attention. The Cairn message carried authority precisely because it was factual and restrained. It did not dramatize events, it stated them. Debate regarding cannibalism resurfaced after further archaeological evidence supported Ray's earlier report. Victorian society responded with a mixture of discomfort and gradual acceptance. Over time, scientific reasoning replaced moral indignation in interpretation of survival behaviour under starvation. The Royal Navy incorporated lessons quietly. Future Arctic expeditions paid greater attention to dietary quality and lead-free provisioning. More consideration was given to lighter equipment and mobility. Engagement with indigenous knowledge, though still uneven, increased in later polar ventures. In the decades that followed, the Franklin expedition became embedded in British cultural memory. Literature, lectures, and memorials framed it as heroic endeavour cut short by harsh environment. Franklin himself was often portrayed as steadfast leader who died before the most desperate phase unfolded. The rediscovery of the ships in the 21st century added new dimensions. In 2014, Canadian researchers located HMS Erebus in relatively shallow water off the coast of King William Island. 2 years later, HMS Terror was found farther south in remarkable preservation. The cold Arctic waters had protected interiors and artefacts. These discoveries confirmed that the ships had not been immediately destroyed by ice. Terror, in particular, appeared to have drifted or been navigated some distance after abandonment. The condition of cabins and stored objects suggested that departure may have been more orderly than imagined. Modern archaeological methods allowed detailed examination of items, recovered ceramic plates, navigational tools, personal belongings. These objects offered intimate glimpses into daily life aboard during the winters. They reinforced the impression of structured routine maintained as long as possible. Scientific analysis of skeletal remains uncovered high concentrations of lead in some individuals. Whether the source was food solder, water systems, or other shipboard materials remains debated. Nonetheless, the evidence suggested that unseen physiological factors may have impaired decision-making and health. The broader historical context of the expedition's legacy shifted as Britain's imperial power evolved. By the late 19th century, polar exploration continued under different nations and methods. The Northwest Passage was eventually navigated fully by smaller, more flexible vessels incorporating lessons learned from prior failures. Within Canada, the Franklin story became part of national heritage. Inuit testimony gained recognition as critical historical source. Collaboration between Canadian authorities and Inuit communities characterized later archaeological work. The Franklin expedition thus occupies a complex place in historical understanding. It reflects Victorian ambition and confidence, yet also illustrates environmental constraint and cultural oversight. It generated knowledge through loss, reshaping exploration strategies. In examining relics recovered from the ships and coastline, historians confront tangible remnants of individuals whose voices are largely absent from record. Buttons, journals, utensils, these items speak indirectly of daily routine and personal habit. The cairn message remains central, not because it explains everything, but because it provides anchor in chronology. From that fixed point, scholars extrapolate forward and backward, assembling probable sequences. The search missions that followed Franklin's disappearance were themselves feats of endurance. They extended Britain's geographic comprehension of the Arctic. They also highlighted the importance of persistence in historical reconstruction. In the end, the Franklin expedition did not achieve its intended passage, yet its story shaped polar exploration profoundly. It prompted reflection on preparation, nutrition, equipment, and respect for local knowledge. The Arctic retains traces still, preserved in cold soil and water. Each new discovery adds nuance rather than finality. What remains is not merely a tale of failure, but of intersection between ambition and environment, between cultural systems, between memory and evidence. As the 19th century moved forward, the Franklin expedition gradually shifted from current event to inherited memory. The generation that had followed newspaper updates aged. Children who had first seen engravings of icebound ships became adults reading retrospective accounts. With distance came reinterpretation. Victorian Britain had initially framed the expedition within ideals of endurance and moral fortitude. Franklin himself was memorialized as steadfast commander who pursued discovery with calm resolve. Statues erected in London emphasized dignity. Inscriptions spoke of devotion to duty. Yet, historical interpretation rarely remains fixed. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, polar exploration entered a new phase. Norwegian and American expeditions adopted lighter vessels, smaller crews, and closer attention to indigenous survival methods. When Roald Amundsen successfully navigated the Northwest Passage between 1903 and 1906, he did so with a vessel far smaller than Erebus or Terror, and with deliberate study of Inuit clothing and travel techniques. Amundsen's success did not diminish the scale of Franklin's effort, but it highlighted differences in approach. The contrast suggested that adaptation rather than reinforcement might be key to polar survival. Heavy ships and elaborate provisioning, hallmarks of Victorian confidence, proved less decisive than flexibility. Scientific inquiry into the Franklin expedition deepened during the 20th century. Exhumations of sailors buried on Beechy Island revealed bodies preserved in permafrost. Autopsies conducted in the 1980s detected high levels of lead in tissues. This discovery generated new hypotheses about the expedition's decline. Lead exposure, potentially originating from tinned food solder or from desalination systems, could impair cognition and physical health. Such findings reframed the narrative from one of simple environmental defeat to one involving hidden technological vulnerability. The very innovation meant to ensure safety may have introduced unforeseen harm. Historians debated leadership decisions with greater nuance. Some questioned whether Franklin should have attempted a more aggressive retreat earlier. Others emphasized that ice conditions in 1846, 1848 were unusually severe. Climatic reconstruction suggests that multi-year ice may have blocked Peel Sound during that period, limiting navigable options. Debate over cannibalism, once scandalous, gradually settled into clinical acknowledgement. Archaeological analysis confirmed cut marks consistent with survival behavior under starvation. The tone of discussion shifted from moral judgment to anthropological understanding. The role of Inuit testimony gained increasing respect. Earlier skepticism rooted in cultural bias gave way to recognition that indigenous accounts had been remarkably accurate. Modern scholarship integrates these narratives as essential components of historical reconstruction. Within Canada, the Franklin story became interwoven with national identity in the Arctic. The discovery of the shipwrecks in the 21st century was celebrated not only as historical breakthrough, but as affirmation of collaboration between researchers and Inuit communities. In Britain, the expedition occupies a place alongside other 19th century ventures, an emblem of ambition characteristic of the era. It illustrates both the reach and the limits of empire. The broader cultural shift from romantic heroism to analytical reflection mirrors changes in historical method. Earlier commemorations emphasized character. Later interpretations examined systems technology, climate, supply chains, cross-cultural interaction. For scholars, the Franklin expedition offers case study and risk assessment. It demonstrates how planning based on prior experience may not account for environmental variability. It reveals how institutional confidence can obscure emerging vulnerabilities. Yet it also testifies to human persistence. The men aboard Erebus and Terror maintained structure for nearly 2 years in ice. They attempted organized retreat when confinement proved untenable. Their endurance was not trivial, even if outcome was fatal. Archaeological work continues to yield incremental insights. Items recovered from the wrecks, preserved boots, navigational instruments, personal grooming tools remind observers that the expedition consisted of individuals with routines and preferences, not abstract figures in narrative. In the long arc of exploration, the Franklin expedition occupies a quiet but enduring place. It did not complete the Northwest Passage. It did not return triumphant to British ports. Yet it altered the trajectory of Arctic knowledge more deeply than its planners could have imagined. By the time the wrecks of Erebus and Terror were located in the 21st century, nearly 170 years had passed since their departure. The ships, resting beneath cold northern waters, were preserved by conditions that once confined them. Cabins remained partially intact. Plates, bottles, navigational tools, and fragments of uniform lay undisturbed for generations. These discoveries confirmed what historians had long suspected. The abandonment of the ships had not been chaotic. Interiors showed order. Objects were left as though departure had been deliberate rather than panicked. This reinforced the impression drawn from the cairn message. Decisions were made formally even when options narrowed. The legacy of the expedition extends beyond relics. It reshaped how future explorers approached polar environments. Greater emphasis was placed on lighter equipment, flexible travel methods, and close attention to indigenous expertise. The heavy reliance on centralized provisioning and rigid naval structure was reconsidered. In Britain, Franklin's name remains inscribed in stone and in memory. Yet modern understanding situates him within broader system, an officer shaped by his time, operating within cultural expectations of discipline and technological faith. He was neither reckless nor omniscient. He embodied Victorian confidence in order and preparation. For the ordinary sailors, whose names appear less prominently, the story speaks of economic necessity and service. Many enlisted for steady pay rather than fame. Their participation reminds us that exploration was not only ambition of officers, but labour of seamen whose lives were structured by naval routine. The Arctic itself remains largely unchanged. Ice still forms and recedes according to rhythms beyond human schedule. Climate variations continue to influence navigability. The Northwest Passage is now traversed occasionally by modern vessels, aided by satellite data and icebreakers. What once required years of speculation can now be monitored in real time. Yet even with contemporary technology, the Arctic resists complete predictability. The Franklin expedition serves as a reminder that environment retains autonomy. Historical interpretation has grown more nuanced. Scholars integrate scientific data, archaeological evidence, Inuit oral history, and naval records. The result is not a single narrative but layered understanding. If one listens closely to the preserved objects recovered from the wrecks, they do not dramatize their past. They simply attest to daily life teacups arranged for meals, boots stored for winter, books selected for long evenings. They reveal routine sustained under isolation. The expedition began within culture that believed steady application of discipline could overcome distance and climate. It ended with recognition that preparation has limits when duration extends beyond design. And yet, the effort was not without consequence. Search missions mapped coastlines in detail previously unknown. Scientific observations advanced understanding of magnetism and weather. Later explorers benefited from lessons learned through loss. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of the Franklin story lies in its silence. There are no surviving journals from the final march, no recorded speeches, only a brief note in a cairn marking intention. History cannot supply the unrecorded thoughts of those who walked south across ice. It can assemble fragments, interpret patterns, and acknowledge uncertainty. If you had lived in that era, trusting in reinforced hulls and preserved provisions, would you have questioned the plan? Or would you have shared the belief that order and persistence would suffice? The Arctic offers no final verdict. It preserves what it can and yields what it must. The Franklin expedition remains not as moral lesson carved in certainty, but as invitation to reflect on ambition, environment, and the quiet limits of preparation. The ships rest now beneath cold northern waters, still and quiet. The ice that once held them has long since shifted and reformed. Season after season, snow falls, it melts, it returns again. The Arctic does not hurry. If you imagine the decks of Erebus and Terror tonight, they are no longer crowded with sailors moving between watches. They are silent corridors, dim and preserved. A plate remains where it was set down. A boot rests beside a bunk. The air, cold and dark, keeps its own careful record. Far to the south, cities continue their ordinary rhythms. Trains move, lights glow in windows, newspapers print tomorrow's headlines. Life, as it always does, carries forward. And yet, in the quiet of evening, the story lingers not as spectacle, but as reflection. The men who sailed north believed in preparation, in discipline, in measured progress. They carried with them the confidence of their time. They encountered conditions that asked more than planning could provide. We do not stand in judgment, we stand at a distance, listening to fragments left in ice and memory.